According to the latest data from the likes of Gartner and what have you, even the best workplaces, 50% of your people will be struggling with burnout, right?
Wow.
In other places, the average is 70%. And, the worst places, it's over 80 odd percent. The minimum amount that is costing your business is $2,000 for every $10,000 you're paying in salaries.
Welcome to the People Powered Solutions podcast. In this show, you'll gain expert advice and tips on building a thriving workplace culture with happy employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be spending this time with you today. Hello and welcome to yet another episode of People Powered Solutions podcast. Today we welcome Alan Cox. Alan is an experienced entrepreneur and mental fitness advocate who aims to redefine the business landscape by promoting mental well-being in the corporate world. Alan's transformative life experiences, including overcoming childhood abuse, mental health challenges, and a near-death encounter, compelled him to commit his life to advancing mental fitness. He offers a unique and refreshing perspective on the often overlooked impact of mental health on business performance. Alan's mission is to revolutionize how business leaders perceive and prioritize mental well-being, as he firmly believes in its competitive edge. His story and message clearly illustrate how investing in mental fitness can outperform traditional business strategies significantly. Welcome, Alan.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, Laurie. Thank you for having me.
So, Alan, how about you tell our listeners how you got to doing what you now do? Tell us a bit about your story and what brought you to offering the services that you offer.
It's a long story, and I'll make it as short as I can. So I think, just to set the scene, I had quite an abusive childhood, and that led to me really struggling through school. I was one of those awkward kids in the corner, always getting into trouble. And all through that time, I guess I had, without really realizing it, I probably had a very low self-esteem. And when I entered the workplace and you start having responsibilities, that's when the cracks really started to open up. So I had a few decades of depression, and sometimes when life events happened that were quite serious, like for example, once I had a back injury where I couldn't walk for pretty much a year. When those kinds of things happen, it really, really does take its toll, and it got about as bad as it possibly could get. There's been a number of those episodes in my life, and all the time I'm trying to work as my own businesses and things like that, and that has its own layers of kind of responsibility and challenges on top of just being an employee, I guess. The straw that broke the camel's back for me was when I nearly got killed in the Canterbury earthquakes here. That led to me losing my business that I'd built up over 12 years or so. That then led to me having quite a severe mental breakdown. And just for anyone that kind of wonders what that is, I always thought that my mental model of what a mental breakdown was simply, somebody's having a bit of a meltdown, they're depressed or something. It's actually a lot worse than that. Parts of your brain actually shut down so that it can survive. So I couldn't talk very clearly. I couldn't walk more than about 20 yards or so. I could only function awake for about, 2 hours at a time. It was really, really dark times. And it got to a point where very, very luckily, a program came on TV where in the course of that hour, I moved from someone that had zero hope, zero motivation to continue living, to someone that thought, actually, there is a pathway here for me. And that really led me onto a journey of transformation, studying everything from psychology, neuroscience, what have you, really getting to understand what's going on in my mind and how I can improve myself. And that journey basically took me like way beyond what I would consider is normal for most people. And that's really when quite amazing things started happening for me. It's just like hundreds of examples. The way I react has become a lot more calm and considered. My relationship with my wife is 100 times better. I work less hours, but I actually do much more work than I ever did. There's just so many things like that. And I think it was just during this journey, because I had such a long period of decades working with larger businesses, I kind of thought, oh my God, like just imagine if workforces had just even 10% of what I've got, it would be an amazing thing. So I've now created an app that overcomes some, quite serious problems in like the mental well-being app space. It's having incredible results for people. We're still fairly early on in our journey, but already I've basically kind of feel very satisfied because I know that it's kind of transformed the lives of thousands of people, and we're continuing to grow that. So that's my life in I don't know how long that took, but maybe 5 minutes.
Not even 5 minutes. Okay. Of course, I'm now going to have you backtrack because there's a number of points. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I really want to touch on a few of the points that you made. You talked about kind of always feeling kind of outsider, being fairly quiet, going through life in motions, and from struggling with a variety of mental health challenges from a very young age. And then in bringing kind of that person that was conditioned throughout your youth into the workforce and having to manage now more stress, more anxiety, having more on your plate, all the while still functioning, if you will, from that depleted state that you'd always ever known, right? Then you said you saw after you had your mental breakdown. About the mental breakdown, as a side note, I 100% am so grateful that you shared what it actually is, because I also always had this vision of someone, running down the street screaming, or we've heard going postal or whatnot, just that crazy losing it out of the blue. So my first question before we get to which program you were watching on TV that time is, did this happen gradually, or did you wake up one morning out of the blue and suddenly, I'm completely, parts of your brain had shut down, you were having difficulty speaking? Or is this something that happened over time, that symptoms creeped up slowly but surely?
You're talking about the breakdown?
Yes.
The actual breakdown was very, very sudden and very, very dramatic. The cause of that was something that basically had built up over many, many years. I'm a very visual person. If you can imagine like a graph where on the x-axis is your mental strength and resilience, and on the y-axis is time. So let's just say that you're an average human being, and let's just say that your resilience, mental strength is about a 6 or 7, something like that. Mm-hmm. When a life event happens, you basically dip down, but you don't dip down very much. And if it's a fairly small thing, you might even dip at all, but you dip down a little bit, but then you recover very quickly over time. But if over many years your baseline resilience level is like, say, a 3 is kind of like the danger line, where on a kind of a mental health perspective, as you transition from being mentally well to being mentally unwell. When you have a much lower resilience, when those exact life events happen to you, that happen to other people, you drop down much lower. And it takes much, much longer for you to basically get back to where you was before. So in my case, I was probably in a position when the mental breakdown happened for me, I probably had a level of resilience of like 1 or 2. So, when you're down at that level, there's a lot going wrong in your brain. Your hippocampus has probably shrunk by 20%, and that has all kinds of other effects. And your brain is actually used for a lot of your body's core functions. You know, it makes your heart beat properly and all of these things, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're at that level and a serious event happens, especially when, in my case, two things happened on top of each other. One, I went through an incredibly traumatic event. And not only did I nearly get killed, but I then came out into this environment where the closest thing I can tell people to visualize it was like the images you saw on TV after the World Trade Centers came down. And it was just the air was just grey white, sure. And there's people basically walking around panicking with blood over them. That's what I came out to. And so that would have been bad enough. And most people would have had to take time out, right? Our offices were basically non-inhabitable. This was a time where all of your computer data was in a server room in the back of there was nothing online.
Cloud.
Yeah, and I then had to jump into being this leader that found a new space for us to work from, and trying to pacify all these customers that, as much as they care about what you're going through, they still want their stuff done, right?
And you're still recovering, not even recovering at this point. You're in survival mode from that initial trauma of experiencing the event itself, and then having to right away shift gears right into that leadership role to kind of captain the ship and help them navigate this new reality. I can only imagine how that would compound to even deplete you even more, and could absolutely lead. And I really like how you described those levels in that graph. That visual was, I'm quite visual myself, so that was really helpful in helping me understand. So for our listeners, I guess one of the reasons I asked that was to maybe help them self-identify if some of these symptoms you might have noticed as you were going through your series of smaller events, maybe throughout your lifetime, throughout your career, that were having you deplete. Kind of when I think of a battery life, when it gets to those last two lines and they start to blip and beep and beep and beep, right? Sounds like before you even had that life-changing event, you were already at 1 to 2 lines. So obviously it didn't take much to push you over the edge, right?
When you, just to carry on with that analogy, is that when your brain senses that you're going to drop to a dangerously low level, that's when it shuts down the things that it thinks you don't really need. You know, it thinks, well, I need a lot of rest, so this body doesn't really need legs to walk over the next few months. It doesn't need to talk. It doesn't need to do all of these things. It doesn't need to be awake all day, you know, and it literally does shut things down. It
falls into low battery mode. Same thing like when the brightness on your phone goes lower and they shut down a lot of the back stuff that's functioning in the back. Same thing. Exactly right. But isn't it crazy how a brain would determine and force you into rest to some extent by determining that legs are a luxury at this point, that they really need you to rest and stop, and that your brain would make you do that.
Yeah.
Wow. So thank you for sharing that. Now let's fast forward to that program that you watched that was life-changing. What was playing on?
There's a program on TV that admittedly is probably quite dated now. It's a BBC program called The Truth About Depression. Okay. And I highly encourage anyone, whether they think they have depression or not, it's a fascinating program to watch. And before I watched that program, 2 things. Firstly, from a position of, you know, where I was, again, being visual, my analogy was I was in this completely black tunnel. I had no idea what way was out, even if there was a way out. It could have been just bricked up at either end, as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. I literally just didn't want to kind of go on, right? Probably like 99% of human beings and your listeners right now, I had no education, school or wherever, about how the brain functions and what it needs to be healthy and what it needs to kind of be fit and strong. what are the kind of the mechanics at play, you know? And you're not only in this hopeless situation, guess what's feeding that hopelessness is that you just have no sense whatsoever of that there's a different pathway here, right? And what that program did, and again, there's quite a lot of, you know, visual stuff in there. I think it's probably about, you know, so it's at least a decade old, right? There's people from Coronation Street on there that suffered with depression and things like that. But it showed these like computer animations and brain scans and things like that, where it actually visually shows what's going on in the brain. You know, it talks about someone that has a long period of either depression or, I mean, it's all a matter of scale, right?
Okay.
But someone in my position, my hippocampus would have been shrunk by 20-30%. Wow. And that would have had a lot of knock-on consequences, you know, like chemical things firing that shouldn't fire, or things that should fire don't fire, that kind of stuff. And so, number one, the program showed me what is happening in my head is real, right? It's as real as, say, a diabetic has a problem with producing insulin, right? Yeah, and it just really brought it down to that real tangible level that you think, oh my God, right? Yeah. What it also showed is that all of that stuff can be reversed. You know, if you do the right things, your hippocampus will grow back within 3 months, right? And if you come back to that analogy of being in that dark tunnel, suddenly I had a candle in my hand. I could see what way was what, and I could see that, oh, actually, there's some light up there. That's the way I've got to go. Yeah. And yeah, I went from, in the space of an hour, I went from hopeless to hopeful. Amazing thing.
That is incredible. And it sounds like that what that program did, it normalized and validated what you were experiencing, where you thought, there's no hope. I have zero control. Obviously, I've got the symptoms happening daily. I have zero control over them. What that program did was offer you a sense of control. That candle was that sense of control, right? And then suddenly you were able to find some light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. Yeah, show me a pathway that I didn't know there was a pathway. Yeah,
absolutely. And then what happened then, and what kind of timelines are we talking about? So you watched this episode 1 hour, then what?
So just to put it into context, when you go through a breakdown of the kind of magnitude that I did, you have this support team around you, and like I was getting visits from like care workers every day and things like that. My diagnosis was that it would be at least 1 year before I'd even be able to return to work on a part-time basis. Okay. That actually made me feel a lot worse. But what happened was, and also another piece of context is, because of the way my brain was functioning at the time, I couldn't really read very well. Like, do you know where you read a paragraph and you think, what have I just read? You know, like it was
no retention. Like yeah.
Yeah. So what I did after watching that program, I started watching material on YouTube. That was easy, right? I can watch stuff. And so I was searching for things like surfing YouTube. And the more I was basically, you know, you watch something about the hippocampus and it basically will tell you about your reptilian brain or something. So you search for that and you go on this path.
I went down the similar rabbit holes, I call them, where I end up where I'm searching something and it's like so far removed but still interconnected with my initial search. And that journey, you're broadening your knowledge and really starting to understand.
It was definitely a very positive rabbit hole to go down. And what actually happened was, in the process of doing that, I was learning things that just gave me this completely different perspective on, I think I was watching this segment from, I think his name, Wayne Dyer, and he was basically saying about how things that irritate him, like say his wife would do things that would irritate him. When he actually thought about it, he said, that's just her way. And I kind of started bringing those things into my life, you know, and at the time, the relationship I had with my wife wasn't great. Like I'd probably put her through hell over the last 10 years or so. And, you know, just something silly. I'm a coffee enthusiast and I've got like a good coffee machine, grinder and all that kind of stuff. And I might have some coffee beans going through the grinder, and once they're through, the grinder just keeps on spinning. And I'm over the other side of the kitchen, and she would turn around and turn off the grinder. It used to infuriate me. It was like I felt like I was being controlled, right? And now that happens, I think she's just turning off the coffee machine. You know, she's just turning off the grinder. That's all she's doing.
We guessed last week that talked exactly about that.
Yeah.
And the importance of digging deeper when you are activated like that.
Yeah.
And I heard you say, I felt like I was being controlled. Yeah. And she says, you need to go inward then and use breath to pull away the curtain to figure out where in your past did that paradigm form.
Yeah.
And to be able to manage it and name it so that you can minimize its impact on you.
Yeah. That kind of thing applies to so many aspects of your life, right? Like, let's just say you're at work and you're a bit late for a meeting, and there's someone in the office that you go, meeting room that you go into, that basically stares at you with you have a simple choice, right? You can do what probably I would have done at the time, thinking he or she is really pissed at me, right? And like, oh, I've really messed up. And then you're probably thinking about that the whole time your attention should be on the meeting. Or you can go in there and think, she's just looking at me, or he's just looking at me. And it might be that she's got those eyes because she's thinking about a problem herself, right? And you know, we make up these stories that have these really negative knock-on effects to everything that comes afterwards. And when you develop the power, without getting too technical, all of those kind of automatic reactions are based on, you know, if you think of your brain as being like an operating system, the operating system has two parts to it, right? It has, say, the software program, and it also has all the data, right? Now, over the years, we've created like an algorithm in this software program that basically says things like, when someone looks at me that way, they think this of me. When a car cuts across me, they are actually trying to kill me or whatever, right? It has all these algorithms, right? But at the same time, we have all this, the data is our like beliefs and all of these things that we've laid down over time, most of which is completely untrue. Let's just use a crazy example of, say, somebody where they've been brought up in a household where the parents have said, oh, you'll never come to anything, or you know, whatever those things are. Yeah, these are quite real things, right? Or in my case, right, I was very creative at school, and all I wanted to do when we like took our subjects and things like that is I just wanted to do things like art, woodwork, history, and my parents basically said, no, don't be daft, you know, that you can't have a career in that, and force me into things like my brain wasn't wired for. If I didn't have that, I would have, you know, for many years, I grew up avoiding anything creative, right? Because I had a belief in my mind, I can't do that stuff, right? And we all have tons and tons of that stuff. Yeah, because over the years, we've been told, you're an ugly bugger, or whatever those things are, or your bum looks fat in those jeans, or whatever those things are, right? And we have this operating system that causes us to think a certain way. And what we have to do over a period of time is, when the operating system causes a reaction, you have to consciously stop and think, hold on, what's happening here, right? And the amazing thing is, if you can basically think, well, it's going to take quite a long time to unpack all of that and craft a new program. And that is true, right? It can take many months, right? But here's the amazing thing. The moment you start to recognize and stop, you actually feel like an amazing shift has happened. Like you kind of feel like, oh, I was on this busy motorway where like there was no way off, and I'm not sure where I'm going, but I've just taken the slip road off to somewhere better, right?
Yeah,
and
for sure.
And then you start doing that as part of your daily life,
and eventually it becomes second nature.
And then
it's literally rewiring your brain. It's rewiring and reprogramming your brain. Okay, so we talked about program change your life. You started researching, and then you started kind of taking ownership over your mental health and really kind of understanding some tricks and tips. I'm also a huge fan of Wayne Dyer. He's got such powerful literature out there to help really improve and to help you really go inside yourself and do that heavy lifting and that hard work in order to come out that much lighter. So definitely, when it comes to the workplace, I love that you shared that example of when you go into a meeting and you're being triggered or activated by someone's behavior. Sometimes you need to just reframe that as saying, that's just who they are. It's actually not about me. And I teach that in my workshops. It starts in grade school, right? Where the world revolves around us, we think, and we make certain assumptions and we navigate life with these narratives that were formed in our youth, in our mind. And these narratives are dictating our interactions and they're tainting our interpretations of those interactions 100%. Now, your mental health app, how about you tell us a bit more about the app itself? When you developed it, what is it you're hoping to achieve with it?
So the catalyst for creating an app, because it almost sounds crazy to create a mental well-being app when there's already hundreds of them out there. I became aware of many things. For example, I became aware of just how, even just a moderately burnt out workforce, how much that actually hurts a company. And what I also learned was that there's been multiple research studies done on most of these leading mental well-being apps. There's not actually any evidence that any of them are helping people. And I found out that over 96% of these apps are deleted within the first 14 days. So I've got this in my head. My God, there are literally billions of people in the world that are not necessarily struggling with their mental health, but they're struggling with stress, burnout, low-level anxiety, whatever why I did it in the first place. And what I found went through my research was one of the main reasons that people don't get on with these apps is that they find them tedious, boring. They're not something they want to spend time with. And also they find that the things that they're asked to do just doesn't fit into people's busy day. So I kind of went back.
Just really quickly, let's name the app. Everyellow is your app, right?
Everyellow, yeah.
Okay, so we're familiar with it, and we'll make sure to share the links to it.
Awesome, thank you. And so I went back to my learnings, and there's this thing called mental conditioning, right? And it happens all over our lifetime. I said about how we create this operating system in our brain, right? Well, that's mental conditioning that's done that. It's when the environment and our experiences have conditioned our brain to work the way it does, right?
Yep. Creates those mental models, for sure.
Yeah. And so I thought, well, how about we use that process in a positive way? So basically what happens with Everyellow is, first of all, we get to know about you in your well-being profile. So everyone has a different personality type. We have 9 pillars of well-being, your ability to stay present and focused in the moment rather than worrying about the future or ruminating on the past, that kind of, that's just one of our pillars. I think it's like, I forgot what it's called, like in music, you have like those dials where you can shape the sound, right? If you imagine everyone has a different shape, we get to learn your shape. And then based on your shape, we download to your app the specifically relevant narrated coaching content that is relevant for you. And then to use the app, you just open the app and press play, right? That's it. every time you do that, we auto-generate a completely new coaching session for you. So you never hear the same thing twice.
That's awesome.
And what you hear is a stream of personalized coaching against a backdrop of music and sound. You can adjust the music and sound to match your mood and your taste. Because we're auto-generating, we can create this on the fly. And a very common thing that we hear is people say, look, because in our onboarding, we say, look, listen to Ever Yellow for just at least 10 minutes every day, right? And by the way, it's not something you have to take time out to do. We promote this idea of habit stacking, so that to remember to use Ever Yellow, you can use it when you're doing something else that you do anyway.
You're walking your dog, you're commuting to work, you can pop it on.
Yeah. Awesome. When you're eating your breakfast, having your morning coffee, whatever that thing is.
Just integrate it with one of your existing routines. Love it.
Exactly. And we often hear people say, look, I know you said just listen for 10 minutes. That's all I intended to do. It was just so nice. And I listened for it for hours.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the other thing you can do with the app is you can basically turn down the vocals so they're barely audible. And there's this scientific theory called supraliminal theory. And it's where your subconscious brain receives information when your conscious brain isn't really aware of it.
Tuned in,
So when you put the voice down to that level, you can effectively work on your mental fitness and well-being while you're working. And I have to be clear, like you wouldn't do this if you was a brain surgeon or something.
Obviously, yes. I'd add that caveat. It's a good safety caveat, but definitely as you're working, whatever you're doing, I like it. If you're crunching numbers or whatnot, you can have that in the background, and it's your music that you probably listen to music anyways. And you're still getting that mental workout from that subconscious level that's absorbing the material. That's incredible. I've never actually heard of that. That's interesting.
And the other thing that it kind of solves for, especially like kind of larger employers, there's a kind of a human trait, I guess, is that when people are struggling, let's just kind of be clear about what we mean by struggling, right? It could simply mean that you've got all this work that you need to get through, and someone else is just giving you more and more stuff, and you don't know what the priorities are, right? And so struggling for one person could simply mean I'm just overwhelmed with how much stuff I've got. I don't know how to prioritize, but I am scared of talking to my boss about it because I worry that he'll think that I'm not good enough at my job. That could be struggling.
Definitely.
But the thing is that employers, they provide, say, access to counselors or EAP services, but they are grossly underutilized. According to the latest data from the likes of Gartner and what have you, even the best workplaces, 50% of your people will be struggling with burnout, right?
Wow.
In other places, the average is 70%. And, the worst places, it's over 80 odd percent. The minimum amount that is costing your business is $2,000 for every $10,000 you're paying in salaries. And the average is $3,700, right? So any business leader or director that thinks that this isn't something we need, that's their problem, right? You've got to start thinking of this as if your workforce was, say, like a V8 engine. If you had like a classic Jaguar or something and it's got this V8 engine, it didn't quite feel like it was running correctly, what would you do? You'd take it somewhere, right? That's the first thing you'd do. And then you'd get it analyzed, and the engineer says it's only running on 5 cylinders, right? That's why it's not running very well. And you go, oh my God, well, what do I need to do to fix it, right? Well, most businesses, if you look at the workforce, they're running on 5 cylinders.
Absolutely, I agree. So I think it's important for them to monetize what it's costing them by not investing in that assessment, in that evaluation, as well as in not providing those tools. As much as they think it's an investment that would be super costly, they fail to recognize what it's costing them not to invest in it. Yeah, for sure.
So getting back to that person that is, say, struggling, but there's a trait where they fear contacting, so that's why EAP and things like that are only used by 6% of the population. What the app also does is it provides a safe, anonymous communication path where you can get that support without fear of
knowing that you accessed it. So really quickly, in the spirit of, if an organization wanted to offer this to their employees, am I hearing that they could purchase it on behalf of all their employees, kind of licensing wise, and then offer it? Oh, that's amazing. That's great. Well, Alan, this has been really insightful conversation, and I love a lot of the information you've shared, just relevant to the brain, the mechanics of the brain, and your story in general. I'm so grateful for you enlightening our listeners with it. What is one nugget of wisdom? If you had to offer us one nugget of wisdom or a strategy or a tip that you'd like to leave our listeners with, what would it be?
I'd probably say, a lot of people have quite a closed mind in terms of, that they're on this mouse wheel and they probably think, I don't need an app like that, right? I would challenge you, and it's not going to cost you a penny, it's completely free. I would challenge you to just listen to Everyellow for 10 minutes a day for the next week. Download it right now, listen for 10 minutes a day, and just see if a shift happens within the week. And that shift happens for way over 80% of people within the first week.
That is amazing. Well, I love that they do have the ability to try it for free for that first week. If they want to continue the conversation with you, is there any way they can continue to follow your journey? You said you're kind of early on in your journey. So where can people continue to follow this journey?
Probably on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, perfect. And we'll make sure to add any relevant links to Everyellow or to Alan's social media with the show notes. So thank you so much for joining us, listeners. And thank you, Alan, for sharing your story with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, folks, thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guest, make sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. Want to continue the conversation? Then head on over to our social media platforms, all of which are also linked in the description, to keep it going. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.